Thank you for coming to the LSAT Test Prep Section 3 out of 3. We have finished the first two, and now we're going to do our final workshop. Today is going to be on reading comprehension. Let's jump right in. There are 4 essential strategies to the reading comprehension section of the LSAT. Number 1, you want to read that passage. Again, you're going to get several passages, but for each of those passages, read it very carefully, looking for keywords and meaning. Very, very important. Keywords and meaning. So you're going to spend a little bit of extra time, if you will, making sure you understand the text. Number 2, answer it yourself first. You've seen this already in the workshop number 1 and number 2. You always want to make sure you have something that you believe to be the right answer before you look at the answer choices. Number 3, you're going to engage in active POE, which is process of elimination, and to make sure to cross off wrong answer choices aggressively. Finally, number 4, if you ever get in a situation where you've got 2 or possibly 3 possible right answers, you're going to evaluate which one holds water the best. Which one seems to be the best answer given the rest of what you're looking at. And we'll look at some examples of that as well today. Now, here are some sample instructions. And it's going to be, again, between that sort of 25 to 29 questions. You're always going to have the standard 35 minutes to do them. But here again, that first sentence says, each set of questions is based on a single passage or a pair of passages. That's how you know you're into reading comprehension, when it talks about those passages in the directions. So we jump to one of these passages. And for today, because of time, I'm just going to go through literally one passage. But we're going to have 8 questions that all correspond to that same passage. And hopefully, through this 1-hour workshop together, you'll get a sense of all the different kinds of questions you could be asked. So for those of you who have a difficulty accessing the document, or if you just want to hear me speak it, I'm going to say it out loud real quick, and then we'll move on. It says the following: from a critical discussion of the work of Victorian photographer Julia Margaret Cameron. What Cameron called her fancy subject pictures, photography in which 2 or more costumed sitters enacted under Cameron's direction, scenes from the Bible, mythology, Shakespeare, or Tennyson, bear unmistakable traces of the often comical conditions under which they were taken. In many respects, they have more connection to the family album pictures of recalcitrant relatives who have been herded together for the obligatory group picture than they do to the masterpieces of Western painting. In Raphael and Giotto, there are no infant Christs whose faces are blurred because they moved, or who are looking at the viewer with frank hatred. These traces, of course, are what give the photographs their life and charm. If Cameron had succeeded in her project of making seamless works of illustrative art, her work would be among the curiosities of Victorian photography, like Oscar Gustave Rengender's extravagantly awful The 2 Ways of Life, rather than among its most vital images. It is precisely the camera's realism, its stubborn obsession with the surface of things, that has given Cameron's theatricality and artificiality its atmosphere of truth. It is the truth of the sitting, rather than the fiction which all the dressing up was an aid of, that wafts out of these wonderful and strange, not quite in focus, photographs. They are what they are. Pictures of housemaids and nieces and husbands and village children who are dressed up as Mary Madonnas and infant Jesuses, John the Baptists and Lancelots and Guineveres, and trying desperately hard to sit still. The way each sitter endures his or her ordeal is the collective action of the photograph, its plot, so to speak. When we look at a narrative painting, we can suspend our disbelief. When we look at a narrative photograph, we cannot. We are always aware of the photograph's doubleness, of each figure's imaginary and real personas. Theater can transcend its doubleness, can make us believe, for at least some of the time, that we're seeing only Lear or Medea. Still, photographs of theatrical scenes can never escape being pictures of actors. What gives Cameron's pictures of actors their special quality, their status as treasures of photography of an unfathomably peculiar sort, is that singular combination of amateurism and artistry. In The Passing of Arthur, for example, the mast and oar of the makeshift boat, representing a royal barge, are obviously broomsticks, and the water is white muslin drapery. but these details are insignificant. For once, the homely truth of the sitting gives right of place to the romantic fantasy of its director. The picture, a night scene, is magical and mysterious. While Cameron's fancy subject pictures have been compared to poor amateur theatricals, The Passing of Arthur puts one in mind of good amateur theatricals one has seen and recalls with shameless delight. All right, you could have heard me say all that, or you can just pause and read it for yourself if you like, if you're watching this on video. We're now going to jump into the ways in which we want to answer these questions. But we're not going to go into the questions until we have done a little bit of pre-work. Like I said at the very beginning, we want to understand this passage very, very well. So the next slide shows that we're looking for keywords and meaning. The keywords I've put in red, the meaning I've put in green. We have to do this step. We cannot just launch into questions. We need to know how the passage is constructed, what are the main components, what are the key words to understanding what it all means. Very, very important before we dive into questions. So what are some of these keywords? Well, looking at the first paragraph, here I've already highlighted some of the keywords. You can see that when they talk about more connection to something than to something, that whole construction of more than X than Y is very critical. So more connection to something than they do to something else. And that's going to be a very good indicator that there's meaning about to happen. Another one is the if-then type of statement, or if this were true, then Y would be true. And you're seeing that over here towards the bottom of that first paragraph. If he had succeeded, if she had succeeded, then it would be among these curiosities, rather than among its vital images. And then we look for meaning. What is the meaning here? And let's go ahead and pop that up in green. You can see that these pictures that she's taking have traces of comical conditions. Those words should really jump out at you as being, hey, I'm about to tell you about what it means to me. Okay? So this comical conditions, that's a very strong language, and that's why we say, wow, this might have some particular meaning. And in the construction of the paragraph, it has a lot of meaning. And then again, it says later, these traces, of course, are what give the photographs their life and charm. We know this is talking about meaning, because the photographs are what it's all about, right? This is the main idea, is that she takes these photographs. But what is the nature of the photographs? Well, now we have some hint as to the meaning behind this passage. The meaning behind the passage is that these photographs are good things. They have life, vitality, charm. These are all the ways in which the photographs are described. So that's how, again, we know that this is related to meaning. Let's look at that second paragraph. And again, as you're reading through, you're looking and saying, actively, what pops out at me? What in the construction of the paragraph says, hey, look at me, because I'm about to say something important? Those would be those keywords. And then, what is it actually saying in terms of the content? How does the content say, hey, look at me? If the content says, look at me, that relates to meaning. If there's something important being said. So let's start with the keywords in paragraph 2. I've highlighted a few of them in red. Let's look on together. So the red ones are showing that near the kind of midpoint to end of that second paragraph, you're seeing that when we look at a narrative painting, we can suspend our disbelief. When we look at a narrative photo, we cannot. Again, this compare and contrast. You're looking for structurally, what keywords are telling me about the structure of the paragraph that says, hey, look at me. And that definitely says it. When there's something in opposition, when there's something contrasting, that's saying something important. We have to pay attention. So then it links to the meaning. So again, if I pull up the green stuff, you can see that the green follows right after that. We are always aware of the photograph's doubleness of each figure's imaginary and real personas. Later on, you see again this dichotomy, this contrast, where it talks about theater can transcend its doubleness. But photographs of those theatrical scenes can never escape being pictures of actors. So in one, it can escape it, in the other, it cannot. You're seeing already that there's meaning behind those keywords. And then again, looking at important meaning. Earlier on in paragraph 2, we see where it talks about there's an atmosphere of truth. And again, they're giving you details about the photographs that Cameron takes. That's how we know it's meaningful, is that it's related to that content directly. And it says directly. It has an atmosphere of truth. It is the truth of the sitting rather than the fiction. In other words, there's a truth in how people are seated for the photograph. There's truth in the people and their stories as they're trying to get dressed up. And that is more important than the fact that they are dressed up as Jesus and Mary, for example, or they're dressed up as Lancelot and Guinevere in the story of King Arthur. So the fiction is not what counts. It's the reality of the actors and the people that counts. You see how you're able to decipher what that meaning is and when meaning is important to a paragraph? That's what we're deconstructing right now. Let's look at paragraph 3. What are some key words in paragraph 3? We're seeing for example. Anytime a passage says for example, they're now saying, hey, I'm about to give you a rich version of what I'm trying to explain to you. I'm giving you another chance to understand what I'm saying. So pay close attention. So it says, for example, and then they talk about how the mast and the oar of this pretty much made up boat represents certain things. Right? The mast and oar are representations rather. And what they used to do those representations are broomsticks. And so there you go. You've got this thing where it's giving you an example of how they used everyday props to pretend to be something fictional. But that truth of those things kind of cannot be hidden, cannot be hidden by Cameron. All right, so we have that. Then later on in that paragraph 3, we see while Cameron's subjects have been compared to poor amateur theatricals, instead, the passing of Arthur puts one in mind of good amateur theatricals. And then one that people have seen with delight. So you see how there's that compare and contrast happening. So while some people think that it's poor, I personally, the writer, the author, think that it's good and it's a delight. So you're already getting a sense of perspective. And again, that's the meaning inherent to this particular author's reality and what they believe. And that's what a lot of these questions are going to ask about, author's perspective. Now that we've broken down a little bit what this paragraph is and broken down each paragraph, we've understood some of those important things. I've highlighted some green areas in paragraph 3. We see that in terms of content, you're seeing how in the first sentence, Cameron's pictures of actors have a special quality. It's that combination of amateur and artistry. That's where the truth of that passage is. That's where the content is. That's where the meat of it is. And then at the very end, it talks about how, again, the passing of Arthur, as an example, puts one in mind of the good amateur theaters that you've seen. So it's a generally good thing. That's the content. Having done all that pre-work, now we can finally launch into the questions. We want to take them one at a time, and when we're looking at those questions, we want to develop our own prediction for what the answer should be. Sometimes that's possible, and when it's possible, that's great. Sometimes it's not possible or too difficult to do, in which case that's okay too. We just look at each of the answer choices one by one. And that's the way you want to answer these kinds of test questions. Predict an answer. If it's strong enough, find what matches. That's the right answer. If you're unable to do so, you can always go down line by line, looking at each answer choice, A, B, C, D, E, till you review all of them. Let's look at question 1. Which one of the following most accurately expresses the main point of the passage? This is an extremely common question. You will get this a lot. You have to be good at this type of question, which is to hear or read everything that you've just read and summarize it. Distill it down to the most general generally important thing about that passage. So think for yourself. What was the main point? And make sure to use your own words. So for me, my own words would be the following. Something like, these photographs can't avoid us realizing the fakeness of people set on a stage. But in the best of photos, this is not important because we're drawn into the fiction of that made-up world. That's the summary of everything I read. So now I look for an answer choice that matches as much of that as possible. Let's look at A. The circumstances under which Cameron's fancy subject pictures were taken render them unintentionally comical. Now here's something that you gotta be aware of. A lot of times wrong answers will only address a portion of the whole passage. The question asks about the entire passage, all 3 paragraphs. But answer choice A only really addresses paragraph 1. And that's why it's wrong. It's not the main idea of the whole passage. So this is what you gotta be careful of. This whole part versus whole business. A is incorrect. B, the peculiar charm of Cameron's fancy subject pictures derives from the viewer's simultaneous awareness of the fictional scene portrayed and the circumstances of the portrayal. So B is essentially saying it's charming because we see the fantasy and the reality butting heads against each other. And that's exactly what we see. In my answer, I talked about how the photographs can't avoid us realizing the fakeness of people, and yet we're still drawn into the fiction. That's where that's butting heads again. We see the reality, we understand the reality, we acknowledge the reality of people as actors, but we also get drawn into the fiction, in best of case. And that's why we see both of them. Answer choice B also says that. So B is pretty good. Let's look at C, D, and E to make sure we can round out what we've heard as the possibilities. C says the implicit claim of Cameron's fancy subject pictures to comparison with the masterpieces of Western painting is undermined by the obtrusiveness of the sitters. Again, it's only taken a portion of what's being said and focusing too much on that portion. When you're asked a main idea, it's got to be globally what's the main idea. C is incorrect for that reason. How about D? The most successful of Cameron's fancy subject pictures from an aesthetic point of view are those in which the viewer is completely unaware that the sitters are engaged in role-playing. That's also not true. In fact, it's been disputed by the passage itself, which talks about the fact that you can never forget that the sitters are role-playing. That is specifically stated, remember when we looked at our meaning? That was specifically stated in the meaning portion of what we did. We identified that you can never get away from that, right? We talked about how the comparisons and the contrasting, you can never get away from a photograph having that sense of these are people pretending to be other people. And so D is clearly incorrect because it is actually going against what was said in the passage. How about E? The interest of Cameron's fancy subject pictures consists in what they tell us about the sitters. And not in the, it's hard for me to read the screen, not in the, I want to say, imagination. Well, in any case, so E, looking at E, the intent of Cameron's fancy subject pictures consists in what they tell us about the sitters. That is also incorrect. The right answer is, in fact, B. So B is the strongest answer. Again, I'm sorry that E got cut off a little bit there, but you should be able to see it if you're watching at home on the video. All right, so that's number 1, and that's how we do it. We look at an understanding of how things are with respect to each of the answer choices. And again, to summarize, A only addresses some of the passage. B is just in general, yes, this does sum up mostly what it's about. We talked about C, how the sitters are not obtrusive. They're charming, so that's why C is incorrect. D is incorrect because it actually goes against what's in the passage. The passage says we can never be completely unaware of them. And finally, E is not true. The third paragraph refutes it because E says the interest of Cameron's fancy subject pictures consists in what they tell us about the sitters and not in the imaginary scenes they portray. Well, that's not true because paragraph 3 is all about how they can go above and beyond that realism and still create a viable fictional situation. So in other words, Cameron can be successful in having this beautifully fictionalized situation portrayed, despite the fact that we know that they're real actors. So E is going against that, and that's why E is wrong. It goes against paragraph 3. All right, that's our first question. Does everybody understand what we're trying to accomplish and how we're doing it? All right, let's move on to question number 2. The author mentions the props employed in The Passing of Arthur as, meaning in order to. So this question basically says, why does the author mention the props? So now we have to go back and look at paragraph 3 and reread portions of paragraph 3. So if we flip back and look at paragraph 3, we want to look at what they say. What does he say about paragraph 3? He talks about how in The Passing of Arthur, for example, the mast and oar of the makeshift boat represent a royal barge. They are obviously broomsticks, and the water is white muslin drapery. But these details are insignificant. For once, the homely truth of the setting gives right of place to the romantic fantasy of its director. So, having read that again, why does the author say that? Why do they use the props? Why does the author use props and talk about the props? Well, the props are there because the props show that it's not a great way of doing it. It's kind of cheap and cheesy. That's pretty much what they're saying. That the props are cheap and cheesy, but the scene and the photograph rises above that cheap and cheesiness to still be effective. But the purpose of the props is to demonstrate the cheap and cheesy. So our answer should be something like cheap and cheesy. Answer choice A says, examples of amateurish aspects of the work. Well, that actually is right. That sounds good. Is it about the amateurism? Yes, it is. The purpose of the props is to show that they were amateur, cheap, silly, ridiculous. How about B? Was it evidence of the transformative power of theater? The answer is no. That is related to the Cameron photographs that ended up being effective. But it's not about the reason for the props. So B is wrong. C, a testimony to Cameron's ingenuity. Not really. If Cameron was more ingenious, Cameron would have thought of a better way to use the props. So no, it's not about ingenuity. In fact, it looks a little ridiculous, so that's a point against ingenuity. C is wrong. How about D? It's an indication that the work is ironic. No, there's no such implication in the passage. They're using the props as if they were for real, like trying to do their best. It wasn't ironic where you use a prop and purposefully make it cheap and cheesy so that the audience goes, ah, wink, wink. This is a cheap and cheesy representation. That means life is cheap and cheesy. No, there's no irony. There's nothing being said by using the props. How about D? Support for a negative appraisal of the work. That would be incorrect. Because again, in paragraph 3, it is not a negative thing. The author is saying Cameron overcomes all of the silliness to still produce something that is a beautiful, a wonderful work of fiction, right? That it does in fact work, and that we do in fact delight in it, to use Cameron's or the author's own words. So E is clearly incorrect. Here you're left with only really one good choice, which is A. A is the right answer. Let's look at question number 3. Number 3 actually does relate back to a specific part of the passage. And this does happen in the LSAT. They may actually ask you to refer back to a certain passage or sentence and ask you questions about specifically that sentence. Here we get an example of that, so this will be good to look at. Question 3. Which one of the following, if true, would most help to explain the claim about suspension of disbelief near the middle of the second paragraph? And where it talks about it is the following. You go back and you chase it down, you find it, and then you reread it, and I've put it up on the screen for you. When we look at a narrative painting, we can suspend our disbelief. When we look at a narrative photo, we cannot. Now, first thing to notice, this does align with our keywords and meaning portion of analysis, remember? So that part of what we did is very helpful at this point, because it already gave us a preview of this particular thing that they're now highlighting. So what is the argument being made about this whole idea of suspending our disbelief? Well, the argument is the following. For Cameron's works, we cannot suspend our disbelief because we see that effort that's being taken by the actors in a real photo, and we don't see that effort, that reality, in a painting. Because a painting, of course, is not a slice of life, right? A photo, you snap it and you get whatever you get. A painting, you craft, you change, you modify, you imagine in your head. So it's not an accurate representation of the people doing the thing that are sitting for your painting. So in other words, yes, you can suspend disbelief for a painting, but no, you cannot suspend disbelief for this stuff, meaning Cameron's photos. All right, now that we've done all that, we look at our answer choices. Answer choice A says, sitting for a painting typically takes much longer than sitting for a photograph. That's not true. In fact, it's the opposite. Photos probably are easier to sit for. Even if it's not opposite, there again is no real talk of how long it takes to sit for a painting. So we really don't know. We could imagine it being opposite, but in reality is not enough information. And again, it does not match what we were predicting. Answer choice B. Paintings, unlike photographs, can depict obviously impossible situations. Now there's one of those answer choices that sounds good, like it's a truism. It might be true in the real world. Yeah, it's probably true that paintings can represent impossible things, and photography has a much harder time doing that. Don't fool yourself into thinking B is the right answer. It's not. Again, another thing to note about answer choice B. It uses some of those words in the question to make you wonder whether B might be right. See, we talk about this disbelief in the question. And now it's talking about how impossible situations might be represented. Disbelief, impossible, kind of sound the same, but again, in the context of what they're talking about here, they are not the same. So again, if you were only to look at the words themselves, you would feel like, oh, maybe there's a connection point here. There's definitely not. Hey, thanks for coming. So that's why you have to eliminate that particular answer choice. So now we look at C. C says all of the sitters for a painting do not have to be present at the same time. Again, this does not connect with our prediction at all. It just simply, that's fine, but that might be true, but it doesn't really relate to what we predicted. So C is going to be incorrect. D, a painter can suppress details about a sitter that are at odds with an imaginary persona. And again, that's a maybe. If we could get rid of these real details in paintings, it might make them more believable. But again, does not, D is a painter can suppress details about a sitter that are at odds with an imaginary persona. So that's saying that the painter has the opportunity to cover up details about a sitter. And so this actually is a maybe because that's probably true. When I look at real photos, I cannot change what's happening about the sitter. In a painting, I can change those details. Instead of showing how they were nervous or they were blurry because I took the photo too quickly, or they happened to show a part of their blue jeans. And of course, this is in the time of Christ, and so there's not supposed to be blue jeans even available in that particular era of time. So I can cover that up in a painting, but I can't in a photo. So actually, D seems like that might be an explanation of how the narrative painting can suspend disbelief, but the photo cannot. So D is, oh, okay, maybe. And how about E? Paintings typically bear the stylistic imprint of an artist, school, or period. Okay, That might be true in general or in life, but does it relate to our answer choice? Does it relate to our prediction? The answer is no, it does not. So here, if you felt like two of them were good or okay, you'd have to evaluate one of the two to figure out which is the better of the two. That's where you do that whole holding water business. Here we see that pretty much D is the strongest one, and so we would answer choice D. It's possible maybe you thought C was okay as an answer choice because since the sitters for a painting don't all have to be present, maybe you thought, okay, well maybe that helps them to be to suspend disbelief, and for photos it's harder to suspend disbelief because all the sitters do have to be present at the same time. I could see that. And then you evaluate, all right, which is better? C, the idea that they don't have to be present all the time, or D, the fact that the painter can just change some details at will, whenever they want. So you look at the two, you say, which is better? Which holds water better? Now hopefully you would agree that D holds water better because D is directly about how painters have direct control, all right? Direct control over the suspension of disbelief, over making it fantastical and covering over some of those blemishes. Answer choice C does not directly show control of that. All right, that's question 3. Hopefully you guys got a good understanding of how that works. Let's now look to question number 4. Again, I told you we have 8 questions. We're at number 4. And you're going through and looking at now this particular question, which says, based on the passage, Cameron is most like which one of the following in relation to her fancy subject pictures? And you might not really understand, well, what are you getting at in this question? You're allowed to read one of the answer choices to get a sense of what they're talking about. Here it says, a playwright who introduces incongruous elements, blah, 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 blah. Once you read that, you realize, oh, what they're saying is, how does this compare? What has Cameron done that compares apples to apples with what someone else might do in another profession? All right, so you just check on A just to figure out, what are you even asking? So now we understand what they're asking. So now we can predict what we believe Cameron has done so that we can then relate it to one of the answer choices. So now I ask you, what did Cameron do? We have to stop and go back to our meaning, understand that what has happened in this passage. What has happened is that Cameron uses these real people in real time. And so these viewers see both the reality of the photo, as in, hey, here's my cousin, here's a guy, here's my roommate, here are these people sitting for this photograph, and at the same time, see the fantasy of the photo. All right, my cousin is dressed up as Jesus, my roommate is dressed up as Mary Magdalene, so-and-so is dressed up as John the Baptist. We're in, the Christ times, right? So they're able to see both. They cannot escape the fact that, well, that's just some young person of in the 2020s, right? That's just a person of modern times. I see that, it's too obvious. The hairstyle is too natural, or it looks too much like what we do today. Those kinds of things. This guy's wearing Reeboks, he forgot to take off his sneakers. Like those kinds of things. We see the reality, yet we see the fantasy. So again, take that meaning and try to say it in your own words. This is so important for you to understand how to comprehend the things you read. And then it's also important, of course, for answering test questions correctly. But it's good both ways. It's good for you to understand and practice comprehending text, but it's also good for you to then be able to apply it in a testing situation. All right, enough of a side note. Let's jump into some of the answer choices and see what sounds right and what might sound wrong. Answer choice A. And here we're getting into process of elimination, attacking each answer and eliminating it if it doesn't sound good. A playwright who introduces incongruous elements to preserve an aesthetic distance between characters and audience. That is not what's happening. They're not creating a distance. They're not introducing incongruous, meaning things that clash. They're not putting forth clashing elements. So none of these things are happening. A is wrong. What about B? A rap artist whose lyrics are designed to subvert the meaning, meaning go against the meaning of a song sampled in his recording. So that's something like if somebody took a sampling of Don't Worry, Be Happy by, I think it's Bobby McFerrin or something like that, from way old school days. I'm showing how old I am. But say they take the Be Happy song, or maybe Happy by, I think it's Pharrell Williams. Anyway, they take a happy song, they take a snippet of it, and then they subvert it by making it all about how life is terrible and I hate life and everything around me sucks. Is that what's happening? Is Cameron taking something that represents something and then subverting it? No, we see no such subversion happening. B is clearly incorrect. How about C? A sculptor whose works, a sculptor whose works possess a certain grandeur, even though they're clearly constructed out of ordinary objects. Well, maybe. There's this compare and contrast that we saw in the passage. There's the idea that they're doing X despite Y. So the grandeur means something good, right? And we see at the end of the passage, we saw that Cameron's works sometimes end up being something good, even though they are clearly constructed out of ordinary objects. And again, we saw in Cameron's work using ordinary people, using ordinary things even, to represent higher things. Right? Using the drapes to represent water, to using broomsticks to represent oars in a boat. So these are all things that the actual passage does talk about. So actually, it shows A could be right. I'm not sure how comfortable I feel, so I need to move on and look at D and E. If I felt very strongly comfortable, I would say, wow, I got it, I nailed it, I'm ready to move on, I'm gonna save me some time, I'm gonna have more time to work on other questions, right? We talked about last time. But let's just pretend, for sake of argument, I don't feel that confident. Let me go through D and E. D, an architect whose buildings are designed to be as functional as possible. Is Cameron all about the functionality? No, not really. So there is no such connection for D. D is clearly wrong. How about E, a film director who employs ordinary people? Yeah, Cameron uses ordinary people as actors, yes, in order to give the appearance of a documentary. Well, E might be right, because there's a sense of Cameron using real people to represent, as actors, to represent, things happening. And there's a sense of, well, in this one it says the appearance of a documentary. Kind of, because Cameron's sort of trying to represent truth and reality, right? To show something that happened in the past. So maybe E is right. So which is better? I want to check. Have you read the passage? Check at a different time?
No, but I'm following.
Okay. So the tricky part is if you haven't read the passage, it might be tricky to figure out which is right, but I'll ask it anyway. Which do you think is better? And this is where we do the whole water test. Is C better or is E better? Based on the little that you know, because I know you came in a bit late.
I want to say E.
Okay. Yeah, and again, that's fair to go for. So the right answer is, in fact, C. And I'll talk a little bit about why, because this is where that extra mile goes, where the good news is you got a 50-50 chance, right? If you got down to C and E, that's still very good. How do you hone it down to getting the exact right answer? If we analyze the two, and again, this is what it means to analyze for holding water. You isolate the two, and you look at each one, and you compare and contrast, until one of them says, yeah, it floats to the top. I am better. When that floats to the top, that's what you choose. So when I go back and I look again at C, what I see is this. There's particularly strong comparison between the grandeur, meaning the goodness, and the ordinary objects. So the grandeur and ordinary are like the key contrast here. And I feel good about that because Cameron's key contrast is the reality of the people, but the fantasy of the situation. It's always back to reality of people, fantasy of situation. So I'm kind of feeling like that's where it goes, and you can see my summary on the upper right corner of this slide, in case you want to follow along. When I look at E, it talks about the film director employing ordinary people as actors. That's fine. In order to give the appearance of a documentary. That's where I'm a little bit confused. Why is it always a documentary? It's a little specific. For Cameron, it's just about a fantasy setting of any kind. But in this answer choice E, it's about giving the appearance of and a documentary. So first, why documentary? Secondary, why is it the appearance of? I don't know. It doesn't quite sit right for me. So for that reason, both the specificity of documentary and the curiosity of giving the appearance of something. Obviously, you're giving the appearance of something. You're filming something, right? You're making a film. But giving the appearance almost makes it sound like they are pretending to be a documentary when they're really not, right? So that sense of pretending to be something is not present in the Cameron paragraphs. And that's why, for those two reasons, I feel like C is just strong at its core, and it represents what the passage says at its core. E adds a couple of elements of strangeness that do not quite fit, and just that tiny bit of difference is enough for me to say, go with C, not E. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you for that feedback. All right, we got 4 more to go, 5, 6, 7, 8, I think. Yeah. So we might run a little bit long. We got started a little bit late, so we'll end a little bit late. Number 5, based on the passage, the author would agree with each of the following statements except. Now this is a great question because this will help you understand, whether for the LSAT or for other tests, how to answer an except question type. The way to go about it is to look at the rest of the stuff in the question, and if it agrees with the rest of that, if the answer choice agrees, you in fact cross it off, right? It's the power of POE, process of elimination. So all we have to do is make that mental shift. When we see that except, we make the mental shift. Now, if something matches the rest of this question, I'm gonna cross it off instead of choose it as the right answer. And I'm gonna do that at least 2 or 3 times. Preferably 4 times, and then I'll get the right answer. So you're aggressively crossing off. They actually would agree with the less realistic medium in the sense that when you look at the comparison between the two of realistic versus fantasy world, they do say things like, well, you know, if this is a situation where it's a painting, you can suspend disbelief. And we can go back to that section right quick. When we look at even here, when we look at a narrative painting, or in paragraph 2, you can see that in paragraph 2, when we look at a narrative painting, we can suspend our disbelief. I'm in the middle of paragraph 2. When we look at a narrative photograph, we cannot. So, in fact, when we look at that answer choice for 5, that is actually something the author would agree with. So again, I'm backtracking, apologize. Backtracking and talking about 5A, that would in fact be something that the author would agree with. So yes, the author does like the Cameron paintings, but the author would agree that other mediums can do that suspension of disbelief thing pretty well, right? Better than photos. Photos you can never escape, other things you can escape. So for A, it is true. Paintings are more immersive than photos. The author would agree, so what do? Cross it off. A is wrong. How about B? Would they agree that amateurishness is a positive quality for some things? Well, that's a very tricky one. I could again see it going both ways. Already we've seen that answer question number 5 is a hard question because in both of our first 2 we've already seen the possibility that it could go either way. So this is a hard question. You won't know that till you see it, but if you find yourself fluctuating, uncertain for several answer choices, for you, that's going to be a hard question. I'm already finding myself fluctuating between possible answers for both A and B, whether it's right or wrong. So again, this is a hard question for me also. So B, amateurishness is a positive quality in some works of art. And again, if you look at the end of paragraph 3, if you go back to that passage, which you could either rewind or you can print it out and look at it, you'll see that they talk about the fact that, well, and sometimes it's like a good theatrical. Not all the time, but sometimes. So sometimes amateurishness can be a positive quality, but also sometimes it just looks amateurish, right? That would probably be the beginning of paragraph 3. All right, so B is actually something they would agree with. So what do? Cross it off. You see how this except question type can be very tricky? You always have to have your ducks in a row. C, what might appear to be an incongruity, meaning something that doesn't make sense, in a narrative photograph can actually enhance its aesthetic value. So this is sort of implied in paragraph 2. It's that whole talk about suspension of disbelief, that a painting can do it better. So again, they would say that for the photograph, the fact that it is incongruous, meaning you're seeing this reflection of reality versus fiction, can make it stronger. That's pretty much what paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 combined are saying. It's, even though they've got this tension between the two, it can still work well. So they probably would agree with C. Again, you're seeing so much trickiness in each one of these answer choices. How about D? We're sometimes aware of both the real and imaginary persona of an actor in a drama. Well, that's nailing it right on the head. That's almost exactly what the author says about Cameron's works. They say, hey, I can see the realism of the person, but I also see the fiction. D is very clearly cross it off. So now you're left with E. You're hoping and praying that it's right, because you're like, man, I went through all the others, I crossed them off. I hope I don't cross off E, because now what am I going to do? So E is a work of art succeeds only to the extent that it realizes the artist's intentions. In other words, this work of art can only be a good thing if it matches up with what the artist intended. And that is also a little tricky. I can see arguments for both. But in general, I feel like this does not really represent what's in the paragraphs, right? You can kind of sense that it doesn't quite make sense. Because there's never a description of Cameron intended this, Cameron intended that, Cameron fulfilled her intention, Cameron failed to fulfill her intention. It's not even implied in the paragraphs. And that's when you say, all right, it's outside of the scope. It's irrelevant. It's not real. They never really did this. So I cannot cross it off. It is not what the author would agree with. And so E is the best answer choice. Whew. All right, if you got through 5, it's going to be easy going for 6, 7, 8.
What was incongruity? What did that mean again?
Incongruity?
Mm-hmm.
So congruous means to be together. Incongruous means to not be together.
Okay.
So incongruous means things that butt up against each other,
Okay.
right? Oil and water are incongruous, right? Ice cream and the hot, hot sun are incongruous. They're not going to work well together. So let's move on to 6. Speaking of the next question, let's take a look. Hopefully now you're getting the flow, you understand what we're doing, so I won't repeat myself as much. We'll try to just move into the analysis portion a little faster for these last 3. So stay with me, we're almost done. Number 6, the passage provides the most support for inferring that in Cameron's era, what was happening. Here is one of those tricky question types that you cannot predict, right? You don't even know what it's talking about till you get into the answers. So this is one of those sad but true, I gotta go down each answer choice. I don't like to do that, and I don't want for you to do that, but some styles of questions will force you to do it, and I'm helping you to understand when you have to do it, when you have to dive in, and when you shouldn't. So this is one of those times you must dive in, if that makes sense. Answer choice A. Well, it provides support that in Cameron's era, meaning the time frame, the time period, there was little interest in photographs documenting contemporary life. Whew. That's a hard one. I feel like we don't really know. I feel like there's not enough information talking about was or was there not interest in photographs. I don't know. I feel very uncertain about A, and for that reason I would cross it off. How about B? Again, B needs to provide a lot of support, right? In what area did it provide the most support for it? Well, if that's the case, it better provide something I can grab hold of. If there's nothing to grab hold of, like an answer choice A, then I better not choose it. And if I can't even grab a foothold, a handhold, there's no way I'm climbing that mountain. So better not choose mountain A. Let's look at mountain B. Photography was practiced mainly by wealthy amateurs. Whew, that's a tricky one too. I don't know. It doesn't really talk about who did photographs and who didn't. I feel like there's not enough information, right? And again, if you feel like you disagree with me, my challenge to you is show me in the passage where it talks about it. right? And really with enough robustness to hang my hat on that I can climb up that mountain. I refuse to climb mountain B. So B is wrong. How about C? Publicity stills of actors were coming into vogue. Again, it's one of those, I don't know. Again, there was no talk of publicity stills anywhere in this whole paragraph, I don't think. So C cannot possibly be right. How about D? There were no professional artists and models. Maybe, that actually seems possible because this Cameron person is using all these actors, right? And I talked about, I'm making it up, right? The cousin, the roommate, the brother-in-law, the boyfriend, whatever. So yeah, D sounds possible. Okay, I'm going to keep that one. How about E? The time required to take a picture was substantial. Is there any evidence that says it took a long time? Well, if you go back to the passage, and again, you want to do that. If your memory does not serve you well, go back and reread a little bit. It does actually talk about how they take a long time to the extent where, it takes a while to get in position. I can't recall exactly where it is. I'm looking now. There is definitely a part where it talks about, hey, they're itchy. They have a hard time not itching, something like that. Trying to see where it is. So it's in paragraph 2 in the middle. Lancelot and Guinevere's and trying desperately hard to sit still. All right, so it talks about the fact that they're having a hard time sitting still. Each sitter endures his or her ordeal, is the collective action of the photograph. That sounds like they're enduring something, right? They're sitting for a long, you cannot endure something that takes a very short amount of time. If you could take it in 10 seconds, bang, that's not enduring. It must have taken some time for them to have endured. So for that reason, middle of paragraph 2, E, there's substantial evidence. When I look back at my passage to look for D, were there no professional artist models? It doesn't really say. Obviously, we hear a lot about how Cameron used real-life people, but it says nothing about the availability of professional models. Maybe there were a ton of professional models. Cameron just chooses to do it because that's her style. Or maybe there were 0 models, and that's why Cameron was forced to use the roommate, the boyfriend, the girlfriend, etc., the father-in-law. But we don't know which way it goes. And that's the way to think about it. Do I live in a world with no models? Can I imagine that? Yes, maybe that's why she had to do it. But can I live in a world where there were tons of models? The answer is still yes, because they don't talk about how there were none available. There could have still been a ton of them and Cameron still did her thing, right? She could still do it the way she does it for those reasons. Not because there were no models available, but because that's how she rolls, right? That's how she does things. So there you go. Not enough evidence for D, just enough evidence for E. I'm grabbing hold of E and I'm climbing that mountain. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, we got just about 5 more minutes left. Let's try to roll through the last 2. Number 7, the discussion of suspension of disbelief, which we've already talked about because of the previous question, in the second paragraph, serves which one of the following purposes? So why does the author talk about that? Now, my first thing is, and this is particularly true if we didn't already have, I want to say question 3 talk about this, or question 2. If that didn't exist, we especially, all the more, want to do the following. If a question points you somewhere, go back and reread that section. So here it's about paragraph 2, right in the middle, to refresh your memory. You have absolutely got to take that measure. If you don't, you're doing yourself a huge disservice by not going back to the text. They gave you the text for a reason, so you could go back and check it. All right, so you go back, you reread, and you feel more confident about answering these questions. And now we look at what are the possible answers. A is, it's the main conclusion for which the discussion of the picture serves as a case study. No, it is not the main conclusion. B, it introduces a contrast in order to characterize the particular nature of our response. it does create a contrast, but it's not about the peculiar nature of our response to the pictures. It might be B. I can see an argument for B. I would keep B, definitely. C, it is the key step in an argument supporting the author's negative appraisal of the project. So again, if you find any element that's incorrect, the whole thing is incorrect. The author does not have an overall negative appraisal, so therefore C has to be wrong. D, it's used to explain a criticism of Cameron's fancy subject pictures that the author shows to be confused. In other words, they're using this suspension of disbelief to show how people criticize it and then say, well, no, that's not true, it's not a valid criticism. That's not what they're doing here. She's not using that as an element to say, well, someone's criticizing, I'm going to now defend it. No such things happen. How about E? It draws a contrast between narrative painting and drama to support the author's conclusion that Cameron's fancy subject pictures are more like the former, meaning narrative painting. So is that what it's doing? Drawing a contrast between narrative painting and drama? Yes, it absolutely does do that. Is it to support the author's conclusion that they are more like narrative painting rather than drama? So, a little bit, because we're aware of a photograph's doubleness, the theater can transcend its doubleness. Can make us believe, but still photos can never do so. So there could be some argument for either of those two. And again, at this point you want to see which holds water better. And B is just a little bit too broad in its nature. It just doesn't say much. It talks about this contrast used in characterizing a particular nature of a response. What is that response? It's not clearly defined. It feels like it hasn't really made a statement. Whereas E is making a strong statement and it is relatively supported in the text. I would go with E. Again, you have to find that foothold, that stronghold, that handhold that allows you to climb the rock. If there's no handhold, don't climb it. All right, so wonderful. So I add a little bit more description to number 7. You can look at that on your own time. And now we'll go on to number 8. Oh, and sorry. Let me go back to 7. I may have rectify something in 7. So 7 actually, it is between B and E. So let me backtrack a little bit. So E actually talks about how it's a contrast between narrative painting and drama to support a conclusion that fancy subject pictures are more like the narrative painting. So when we look back, we actually say, well, it doesn't say that it's more like narrative painting. It says it's unlike narrative painting and it's unlike narrative drama too. It's unlike both of those. So E is actually incorrect. B is the better choice because it's showing our response to the pictures in general. Yes, it is a general thing. It doesn't get into details, but it's not absolutely wrong, which E is. So E is actually incorrect. B is correct for answer choice for question number 7. So let me just rectify that. 7B is the right answer. So you already can see how tricky these can be, right? A lot of times the does it hold water is the very hardest step to get right. When you have it down to 2, in this case B and E, sometimes the very hardest thing is which one is better? It's so hard. So now let's take a debrief and just say, well, you have to make sure you're understanding your way of thinking. Number 1, don't spend too much time evaluating the 2 choices. You can waste easily 4 or 5 minutes going B or E, E or B, B or E. In fact, sometimes you just need to scan it quickly and just go, I'm going to go with my gut. Because it's a 50-50 shot in the dark regardless. Sometimes overanalyzing will not help you. So that's the first thing I would say. But secondarily, if you are going to analyze it, do some of the steps we've done here. Look for things that are clearly wrong and cross them off. Look for the handhold. If I can get a grip and I feel really good about that grip, I'm going to go ahead and climb that mountain and not the other. These are the ways in which you try to parse out the B's versus the E's. The does it hold water type of questions. All right, enough said. The right answer again is 7B, not E. Let's go to 8. The main purpose of the passage is, so again, we want to put in our own words before we look at it, because we can evaluate what the main idea is. What I would say it is we used common people in narrative photos, which can be a good thing, but it is a bit silly. The ending photo can be magical, sometimes, or mysterious, or delightful. These are actual words in the paragraph. Paragraph 3. So that's how I would summarize the whole thing. Now, which matches up with it? Is it to chronicle Cameron's artistic development, culminating in a masterpiece called The Passing of Arthur? No, there's not like a development progressing from paragraph to paragraph. How about B, to argue that the tension between Cameron's aims and the results she achieved enhances the work's aesthetic value. So is there a tension between her aims and the results? And does it make the work better? Yes, both of those things are here. There's a lot of tension between what she's trying to do and what she actually does. And there's a lot of talk about how sometimes it's elevated, sometimes it turns out great. All right, so B is really the strongest answer choice for this particular question. C talks about how showing Cameron's essentially theatrical vision accounts for strengths and weaknesses. There is a bit of strength and weakness, but it's not really talked about as such. And again, there's no theatrical vision of any kind. So C, you find something clearly wrong, you latch onto it, cross it off. D, explain why Cameron's project of acquiring, for photography, the prestige accorded to painting was doomed to failure. First of all, did Cameron fail in the eyes of the author? No, so already we cross off D. See how we're latching onto things that are untrue? E, to defend the masterpiece, Passing of Arthur, against its detractors, people who don't believe in it, by showing that it transcends the homely details of its setting. E is actually okay, because it does transcend those details. But is it a masterpiece? The author never says it's a masterpiece. In fact, the author says they use broomsticks for this stuff. That's terrible. But they were somehow able to transcend it. But it is by no means a masterpiece, probably by any stretch of the imagination. So that's why E is incorrect. All right, well, that's the end of our session. I want to recap for you very briefly. Number 1, always focus on keywords and meaning. Always really review that passage. Understand it fully before you look at any questions. 2, when you look at questions, try to answer it for yourself first. This is the best and purest way to get as many right answers as possible. Number 3, actively use process of elimination. That's where you're attacking the answers, trying hard to cross them off. Finally, when you're left with possibly 2, maybe 3 answer choices, now you have to figure out which one holds water. Don't spend too much time doing it. But if you can, analyze each in succession to see which one is truly better. Now you're really getting out into the nitty-gritty. What can I really get a handhold or a foothold on? And what absolutely has no handhold or foothold whatsoever, I really should cross it off. And that's how you do it. For more practice, go to lawhub.lasc.org, as you can see on your screen. And please, again, complete this short survey. It'll just take you 3 minutes. With that, I want to conclude today's session on reading comprehension. My hope is it'll help you on the LSAT test, but in addition, it'll help you in general to understand test-taking strategies that you can take with you throughout your Winston-Salem State University career. Thanks for coming.